Hello everybody, welcome back to another brand new episode of Mega Projects. You'll notice that I'm not wearing my Mega Projects merch shirt. That's because I have it in my hands. The microphone, when it was clipped to the collar of the t-shirt, was rubbing against my skin and causing some interference. So yeah, I'm not wearing it today, but if you'd like to get your hands on some cool Mega Projects merch, what is this one? This is the A12 plane. We've got a bunch of other cool blueprint shirts. I'm really not displaying this very well. If you head to the link below, you'll find all of the cool stuff that we have going on in the Mega Projects merch store. This video is all about the Civilian Conservation Corps. I had never heard of this. I looked into it. I still had never heard of it, but it was suggested a few times in the comments and people upvoted it like crazy. So I said to the writer on this channel, Ollie, go learn about something new. And he said to me, Simon, this was actually super interesting. So I'm looking forward. I hope you are as well. Let's jump in. The Great Depression caused devastation around the world, but perhaps it is remembered more visibly in the United States than in other countries. Images of the Dust Bowl and weary travelers heading west for what they hoped would be a better life have become iconic. It was a catastrophic time for the country, and one that called for radical and inventive ways to overcome it. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, was a work relief, and I'm definitely going to say corpse at some point in this video. It's one of those words that always catches me out. This was a relief program that ran across the United States from 1933 to 1942. Initially, it covered unemployment, unmarried men aged between 18 and 25, but it was eventually expanded to the ages of 17 to 28. The goal was to provide jobs and financial support for the millions left without work. Primarily, it was focused on providing manual labor jobs related to the conservation and development of natural resources in rural lands. It played a key part in President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, which was a series of programs, projects, and financial reforms aimed at reversing the effects of the Depression. Nowadays, the very word socialism is regarded by many in the United States with utmost disdain. Check out the comment section below for more on that, assuredly. It is a word that is thrown grenade-like into the public sphere, but most Americans seem oblivious to the fact that many programs that were enacted during the New Deal would be considered hugely socialist today, but they did work. The CCC not only helped raise the country from the despair of the Great Depression, but many of the facilities and trails still found in national parks today were also the result of this effort. The program may have ended nearly 80 years ago, but its legacy still lingers across the United States. While the CCC was a nationwide project, it was based on a smaller version that had been trialed by the then governor of New York, Franklin D. Roosevelt. This was known as the Temporary Emergency Relief Administration, TERA, and began in 1932. The project was a great success, with 25,000 participating in the first year alone. In 1933, after he had won the presidential election, FDR proposed a much larger program to Congress. He said, "I propose to create the CCC to be used in complex work, not interfering with normal employment and confining itself to forestry, the prevention of soil erosion, flood control, and similar projects." His vision was for 250,000 men to participate in the program at any one time, and that number actually reached over 500,000 at one point, and this all became reality on the 5th of April 1932 when he signed an executive order creating the CCC. Robert Fechner, a former labor union official, was appointed director. This would be a unique program in that it would be jointly supervised by 4 governmental departments. The Labor Department would recruit the men, the War Department would look after the camps, and the Agriculture and Interior Departments would organize and supervise the projects. Considering how painfully slow politics and social programs can be today, the CCC took shape at breathtaking speed. After FDR had signed the executive order on the 5th of April, things moved quickly with the first enrollees chosen just 3 days later. 9 days after the first camp, NF1, Camp Roosevelt was established at George Washington National Forest near Luray, Virginia. On June the 18th, Clayton County, Alabama saw the inauguration of the first of 161 soil erosion camps, which, as you might guess, focused focused on soil erosion, often by building small dams, planting grass and trees, but also educating local farmers on how to plant crops in ways that reduced the estimated $400 million, nearly $8 billion today, worth of crops lost every year due to soil erosion. By the 1st of July 1933, a little under 3 months after FDR had signed the act into effect, 1,463 working camps were dotted around the United States. In total, this included 250,000 junior enrollees aged between 18 and 25, 28,000 veterans, 14,000 Native Americans, and 25,000 adults in the locally men LEM program. These adults were used mainly in supervisory roles, while veterans were added under an amendment to the law on the 11th of May 1933, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next section. It was a speed that seems pretty much unimaginable today, but it shows just how quickly governments can move when the need is truly great. The situation really couldn't be any more different today. While the CCC was certainly focused on stimulating a stagnant economy and providing income to those who were in serious need, it also aimed at rebuilding the country's shattered morale. With unemployment around the 25% mark and high rates of poorly educated teenagers, organizers knew that it was a vital moment for the United States. Work on the CCC was hard manual labor, but those involved hoped that this would instill a strong work ethic in young men that they would be able to take forward. There was also plenty of civic, moral, and social education to go along with the hard work. The idea was for the CCC to produce not only strong, hard-working men, but also independently minded men who'd be able to set a solid foundation for future generations. As the years progressed, the CCC became much more militaristic, and when the draft began in 1940, it was common practice to choose officers from the CCC alumni. So, as I mentioned earlier, enrollees in the CCC at the beginning were unmarried, unemployed men aged 18 to 25. They were required to enroll for a minimum of 6 months, and typically their family needed to be on local welfare relief for them to qualify. They could participate in a total of 4 programs with gaps in between, or up to 2 years consecutively. Work on the CCC camps involved 40-hour work weeks spread over 5 days. Saturday could be used as a working day if weather meant it couldn't be done on the other days, but Sunday was rarely used. Enrollees received $30 a month, about $600 today, but between $22 and $25, that's $438 to $498 today, of that had to be sent back to their families. They did not need to pay for food, housing, clothing, or medical care, as this was all included under the CCC. The early days of the program saw a hugely diverse group of men enroll. 55% of enrollees came from rural communities, with 45% coming from urban areas. The level of education of the enrollees was often low, with 3% being illiterate, 38% having less than 8 years of school, 48% not completing high school, while just 11% had graduated from high school. Perhaps most shockingly of all, at the time of their enrollment, 70% were malnourished and poorly clothed. On the 11th of May 1933, FDR amended the law to include veterans, many of whom had fought in World War I. This had come as a result of the Bonus Army Marches, which had been led to Washington in 1932 and 1933 to demand that the US government give early redemption of bonus certificates for service in the armed forces that had been given out to veterans, but which could not be cashed until 1945. The veterans worked in the CCC camps from the very start, but were normally allocated to veterans-only camps and could be married or unmarried. All enrollees could receive additional pay for several rated positions to help with camp administration. Positions included senior leader, mess steward, storekeeper, assistant leader, company clerk, assistant educational supervisor, 2 cooks, and 3 second cooks. These positions could bring their pay to $36 to $45 a month, $717 to $896 today. The CCC camps typically accommodated between 100 and 300 enrollees. Permanent structures were eventually added, but the earliest years saw the camps composed almost entirely of just army tents. The camps included officer and technical staff quarters, medical dispensary, a mess hall, recreational, educational building, lavatory and showers, of course, technical and administration officers, tool room and a blacksmith shop, and a motor pool garage, as well as tented accommodation for the enrollees. Typically 50 people would sleep in a single tent. They were big tents. Food varied slightly depending on which camp you were in, but the following is an example of what was on the menu at the first camp to be established, Camp Roosevelt. Breakfast consisted of oatmeal, milk, bacon, eggs, potatoes, bread, butter, and coffee. Dinner included frankfurters and sauerkraut, boiled potatoes, creamed carrots, peas, rice pudding, bread and butter, and coffee or cocoa. Supper was Irish stew, coleslaw, mashed potatoes, string beans, bread and butter, custard pudding, coffee, or iced tea. Now, no doubt, this became just a little bit repetitive, but considering millions across the country were suffering malnutrition at the time, I'm sure the enrollees could just about handle it. Over 300 types of work projects fell under the CCC, but could generally be placed into 10 different categories. Structural improvements, bridges, fire lookout towers, service buildings, transportation, truck trails, minor roads, foot trails and airport landing fields, erosion control, checking or building dams, terracing and vegetable coverings, flood control, irrigation, drainage, dams, ditching, channel work, rip-wrapping, essentially piling stones to stabilize an eroded bank, forest culture, planting trees and shrubs, timber sand improvements, seed collection, nursery work, forest protection, fire prevention, fire pre-suppression, firefighting, and insect and disease control, landscaping and recreation, public camp and picnic ground development, and lake and pond site clearing and development, range, stock driveways, elimination of predatory animals, wildlife, stream improvement, fish stocking, food and cover planting, and finally miscellaneous, emergency work, surveys, and mosquito control. I bet that last one was awesome. Now, I know that the title of this section sounds pretty bad, but remember this was still 1933. As forward-thinking as much of the conservation work that was being done was, desegregation of the United States was still a long way off. The leaders of the southern states had made sure that everything included in the New Deal remained solidly segregated. Black and white workers rarely worked together, and while camps in the North originally began as mixed, by 1935 all camps in the US were segregated. You probably won't be surprised to hear that despite equal pay across ethnicities, non-white workers rarely made it into supervisory roles, and in fact Director Fechner refused point-blank to place any black workers in these roles except for Education Director in the black-only camp. The segregation also went much further than just white and black. The CCC also included Native American sections who worked close or on their reservations. These differed slightly in that they did not constitute any permanent camps. Instead, enrollees aged between 17 and 35 moved from project to project along with their families and were supplied a rental allowance. In 1933, over half of the eligible men of the Sioux Nation were employed by CCC-ID, the Indian Division building roads, schools, and other services on reservations. Another key element, which was attempted at least, was to improve the quality and value of the land on reservations by reducing erosion. CCC-ID also went much further than other programs. Its educational classes included gardening, stock raising, safety, native arts, and academic subjects. Vocational training was also offered in carpentry, truck driving, radio operating, surveying, and many others. From 1941, Native American enrollees began participating in defense-oriented training, and a total of 85,000 took part in the program, 24,000 of whom later served in the US military during World War II. Fun, interesting fact for you here: on D-Day, US military planners were worried about the Germans intercepting communications, so they struck on a simple yet brilliant idea. Native Americans were often used and communicated in their own language rather than English. I can just imagine the look of bafflement on the German faces when they heard that. Despite some early opposition from unions, broadly speaking, the CCC was a popular program among the public. In 1935, the Emergency Relief Appropriation Act passed Congress, which not only continued the funding for the program, but also expanded the age range to 18 to 28. August 1935 saw the program's peak in terms of numbers, with 505,782 men in about 2,900 camps. By June 1936, this number had reduced to 350,000 enrollees in 2,019 camps, but it remained hugely popular. On April 18, 1936, a Gallup survey found 82% of respondents, including 92% of Democrats and 67% of Republicans, were in favor of the CCC. In June 1937, funding was extended for a further 3 years and the age limit was changed once again to 17 to 23, with the requirements also slightly amended so that enrollees needed to not be in regular attendance at school or possessing full-time employment, rather than be linked with welfare relief. Vocational and academic training was also added to the CCC, and enrollees were required to take part in a minimum of 10 hours of classes each week, while students in high school were allowed to enroll in the program during the summer holiday, or vacation, as they probably called it there. 1937 also saw the CCC respond to disaster relief for the first time, in particular to flood damage in New York, Vermont, and the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys, and after the 1938 hurricane which battered New England. In 1939, the CCC ceased to be an independent entity and was instead transferred under the general control of the Federal Security Agency, though the National Youth Administration, U.S. Employment Service, the Office of Education, and the Works Progress Administration also shared responsibility of certain aspects. As the war began to rage in Europe and Asia, the CCC took on a much more militaristic tone, and an increasing number of projects were redirected to focus on national defense, with the CCC often responsible for constructing military training facilities across the country. It might be a little unfair to call it a decline because the CCC was never meant to be a permanent program. It had remained widely popular across the country, but as the effects of the Depression began to ease and job opportunities began to increase, its numbers dropped, which for a relief program must surely have been a good thing. But everything changed after the 7th of December 1941, a day which will live in infamy. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and the declaration of war by Germany 4 days later meant that the United States had suddenly been catapulted into a global war. Almost all CCC programs, except for wildland firefighting, were quickly shifted to training facility construction. The CCC had been scheduled for termination at the end of 1943, but Congress brought it forward by a year and the order for liquidation came on July 2, 1942. By the same time, a year later, almost all of the nuts and bolts had been taken care of, and the CCC was officially no more. Some of the camps did remain and were used by smaller groups such as conscientious objectors who were put to work on the US mainland rather than fighting overseas. They were also used to house prisoners of war after they returned to the United States, and also to inter many Japanese Americans during the war. This was a period of time when many of those with Japanese ancestry were forcibly relocated to the camps. The CCC was one of those rarities in the United States, a social program that, broadly speaking, most people not only agreed with, but enthusiastically supported. Strangely enough, the country now finds itself in a similar position with record unemployment, albeit still much less than the Great Depression, as of right now at least. For some reason, I don't quite imagine Donald Trump or Joe Biden enacting anything quite like the CCC today. As I mentioned at the start of this video, this was a socialist program in everything but name, and one that was enormously successful. The CCC, along with the New Deal, which it was a part of, fundamentally helped rebuild a bruised and battered country. Of course, it was not just down to these programs, but what they did helped to lift America out of the doldrums. As the United States, and indeed many parts of the world, sink into their own 21st century doldrums, what have we learned from the past? The CCC was truly a radical initiative that was enough to help spark a revival. The question now is, do we have the drive and togetherness to do the same in 2020 and beyond? So sound off in the comments below. That's going to be a fun comment section. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please do hit that like button. Also, if you didn't or you disagree with it, well, use the dislike button. That's what it's for. And as always, thank you for watching.